Welcome, my dear friends, to CHFS 2107. This is going to be our Chapter 12 presentation looking at late adulthood. And I just wanted to welcome everyone. And, I know everybody, these are stressful times and there's a lot going on. And maybe we can take a break from that for the next hour and a half or whatever, and talk about some of these things and look at this idea of like, what are we going to care about when we're later in life? And how can that maybe help us direct what we focus our attention on now? And how we maybe battle to stay focused on the signal and avoid some of the noise in this hectic world we live in. I feel blessed to have an opportunity to share some thoughts with you, and this nip-sing teaching thing has been a really nice addition to my life, and I really appreciate it. And some of you have sent me some really kind messages and stuff, and things like teaching are different when you care about the people that you're talking to. And it's just like, I've never been to North Bay, and I feel like I have this like growing connection with North Bay. I'm gonna have to get up there. We're gonna have to do something. I'm gonna have to come to, like, I don't know if Nipsing ever does conferences or something. I'm gonna have to come to North Bay at some point. I definitely need to start getting some North Bay gear. I need to get like a North Bay hoodie or something for when I'm doing these. Anyways, love yous. Let's get into this. Late adulthood. Well, we may as well jump right into the heart of it. Erickson used this term integrity, right? So if you could have this, basically you could define it, the sense that one's lived a useful life, but it's like so much deeper than just one sentence. Like, think about what that means. Like, so you know that when you're getting older, you're going to become more philosophical in your thinking and more reflective in your thoughts and more focused on this idea of like, who was I? And we're going to talk about how this is like kind of paired to more general realizations around mortality, right? Like, you start to get to this age where you realize, like, I'm not going to be alive forever. I'm starting to feel all these physical pains. Maybe I'm getting bad news from the doctor. Maybe I'm starting to see things come to an end, and I'm in this like really reflective state of like, what was this? What were these 80 trips around the sun where I was magnetized to this rock? Did I do anything that was valuable? Did I love? Or did I get caught up in nonsense constantly? Did I feel pressured to be someone I wasn't? And did I say things I didn't believe? And did I treat good people poorly? And Erickson's, it's a weird way to present this slide, I know, but Erickson's point is that those are the type of questions you're going to have. You're going to be trying to come to terms with the life that you lived and the opportunities that you've either had or squandered, and realizations of mortality. And so the question becomes, did you live the life you can be proud of and that can give you your ego integrity? The part of me that's Mike, can that part of me feel happy about who Mike was? There's really no deeper question. Like, when I'm looking back over who I've been, is it a happy thinking process? Is it something I feel pride, not the good use of the word pride for? Am I thinking about kids and people I helped and things I tried that pushed myself and ideas that, or places I went to, or that person I helped that was never able to pay me back and that no one knows about, but that was maybe the most important thing I did?
Is there God? Does God care about me? Does it matter what I care about God? Am I going to just disappear? What about my daughters? What about my wife? It's not a simple stage to be in. It's the most philosophical of Erikson's developmental stages. It's the most self-critiquing, in a way. I should say that differently, because it's not like the identity stage isn't self-critiquing. It's the most life story critiquing stage. People blow by these late Erikson stages. And to me, it shows a lack of to Erikson, he didn't a lack of depth. To Erikson, he didn't think that like the trust stage for babies was super important and the integrity stage was way less important, right? Like he had these mapped out as these are like essential processes. It's like you're eventually going to be older, and when you're older, you're going to care about the life you lived, and how you answer those questions I was stumbling through is like going to determine the quality of your mental life. And he said the challenge is to try to live your life in a way that you'll end up with a sense of ego integrity. Remember, ego to them, just in the early days of psychology, they actually called psychology ego psychology. Ego is this, not in the modern use, but in the Freudian use, meaning that stabilizing part of the psyche that's balancing the id and the superego, and that is Mike. It's not my impulses, it's not my training, it's not my nature or my nurture. Id, superego. You can almost look at the id as the nature and the superego as the nurture. I just freestyled that comparison, but I think that's actually true. And then, so what's the ego, right? And you always see ego in like your Psych 101 book as like this like middle of a teeter-totter with the id and the superego on each side, and it's a kind of silly way of saying it, but it's actually not. It's actually kind of what it is. Right? Like Erikson literally calls it psychosocial. It's like your psychology is, which is yours, is an emergent property through your interaction with your social world, which is nurture. There is no nature nurture. Nature is nurtured. Just a quick note, if you're obviously noticing like there's like some sound in the background, I have this new mic box. I don't know how I can show you. This is going to be sloppy for doing this live, because I have to pull this computer star here. So you can see kind of, I don't know if you can even see that, but see there's a screen, right? And here you can see that this is like a box. And in the box you can see there's the mic. And then I got the music playing down there really soft. Okay, now just maybe don't look for a sec, because it's going to be awesome. Poor mic is sick. There you go. But what the idea is that, let's just be honest, I'm kind of just doing this all in my basement, right? So I'm just using my normal computer. This summer I'm starting to, every paycheck stash aside a little envelope. I'm gonna make a major computer hardware upgrade this summer, and I don't want to do something small and just get like a bit better computer. Like I'm gonna get an Alienware like gamer computer, and take this stuff to the next level. It's like so much of my time now is spent like trying to process or re-render these huge files, and it's like I need a little bit more muscle power on my old CPU, and that's coming. So sorry, now I'm all like adjusting everything because piece fell off my chair. That's how it is. So anyways, that whole like minute and a half start of garbage time at the start of this slide was basically just me trying to say like, I think that that's a better alternative, even if it's a tiny bit annoying. I hope that you don't mind it. It's better than a zzz kind of buzz, right? Which is just a hum my computer makes. I need to get a second sound thing in case the computer get an extra long cord so I can have the computer farther away from the mic. But all this is stuff I don't need to say out loud, but a lot of you are emerging video creation experts. Let's get this a little bit higher. So, that's a little bit too high. All right. I should restart this slide but I'm not gonna, because I love yous and there's a little behind the scenes for you. Okay, despair. I want you to think of the word despair as sort of like a depression, but combined with a realization that what's done is done. And that's a more devastating depression. You're not 22, and I know some of you are 22, so don't feel like that's a personal attack. I'm just saying you're not young. You're not like a young adult who made some mistake and maybe in a relationship or something, and now it's like, okay, well, you've learned your lesson. It's like this guy in the picture. It's like, what's he gonna do? Like, go find true love again? Like, maybe he's in his 80s and he cheated on his wife, and then I'm making all this up. I don't know this guy, obviously. And then maybe his wife dies, and he has tremendous regret about not being more truthful to her. It's like, what do? Go be truthful to her again now that she's already gone, and now that you're in your last days? And it's like Erickson said, that's a dangerous position to be in psychologically. That's despair. That's complete despair. That's yelling at God. So despair includes this element of existential. What did I mean? Why did I just blurt out it's yelling at God? It is. It's protesting against the unfairness of life. It's like, why is this like? There's a lot of why me in this despair. A lot of how. A lot of I wish. Right? And so Erickson says this is actually like the opposite of being in a position where you feel like you lived a good life. You're feeling like you lived a life that it fills you with despair to think about. So he says, okay, because the person's failed to achieve ego integrity, and it makes them feel hopeless, and they have not enough time left to make any meaningful changes that would affect that. Okay, so Erickson thought this idea that when you're later in life, you're going to be more reflective, you're going to be more philosophical, you're going to be more caring about these like big picture things, about like if what you were doing actually mattered and if you actually contributed to the people around you and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, even though there's not a ton of research on this, we do know that older adults tend to get more reflective and philosophical. So think of those two things, right? Because it kind of goes together. You're becoming more philosophical in your thinking in general, right? So thinking more at that level of like how all these things are interconnected and how this relates to this, and then reflective meaning like focusing even on your own experience and how. So what's the quality of that philosophy? Right? Is it all this like negative, I wish this was different and this was different and this was different and I had been this kind of person and I didn't do this thing? And it's like, it's interesting because what we also know is that people that seem to have achieved some kind of like satisfaction with how their lives turned out tend to report having less fear of death, which is very interesting. Right? People tend to have a lot of negative emotion over things that they wish they had done. Thwarted personal goals. Right, so I think this is kind of an important point because it's sort of making this point that as you're getting older, right, one of the reasons that you move into this integrity versus despair stage is that your general thinking gets much more at the philosophy level, much more at this level of like, oh, what was this thing that I like, getting philosophical about the relationships you were and who you were in those relationships and who you were to your kids and who you were to your friends. Right? And if those have nice answers, then Erickson thought it was associated with integrity, as we've kind of been talking about. And if it doesn't, that it was associated with despair.
So the next term I'd like you to have, please, reminiscence. So this is this idea of, and you know what to reminisce means, right? You get together with your friends and that you maybe go to camp with or that you play on sports with, and it's like you tell like all the best stories. Remember this time when this happened, this person did this hilarious thing, and this person did this bonehead thing, and then this person had this amazing play, and then it's like all these are like kind of the narrative of the group. That's actually healing. Do you know Viktor Frankl? I'm going to tell this story in the other class, but so Viktor Frankl he's one of the most famous psychologists, but that's later in his life. Earlier in his life, he was in German-occupied Europe during World War II, and because Austria was basically Germany in terms of, it wasn't Germany, but it was controlled by, I should say, occupied by. And Frankl was imprisoned, right? He was like literally thrown in Auschwitz, and Frankl used to do this thing where he would get people together, right? So now think about this. Think how intense this is, and this is why Viktor Frankl is so interesting. One of the reasons is because his ideas came from such a difficult place. He would get people in circles and get them to talk about their favorite things. Right? He'd get people in circles and be like, hey, let's go around the circle and everyone tell us about your favorite pet when you were growing up. And then later it'd be like the next day, maybe it's like, everybody tell us about where your favorite vacation spot is. It's like, oh, this sounds silly and just, you know. Silly? That actually kept them alive. It's like, because what it did was, it's actually brilliant, because what it's giving them an exercise that makes them combat the tendency to stay in a negative, skewed spiral constantly, right? It's like, no, let's fill your mind with thoughts that can heal you. It's like why at senior centers they have a lot of success when they do like Elvis nights and stuff. It's like, you want to do something that's going to make you a lot of money in the future? Invent VR apps for seniors. Honestly, imagine if you could invent a VR Elvis concert app. People have no idea how huge Elvis was. Oh my god. Picture like the top 10 most famous people now all in one person. Because what happens, right? Say my mom's 20 years older, right? So my mom right now is in her like mid-60s. Imagine if she was like even 10 years older. She's in her mid to later 70s. And sorry, Mom, if you ever watch this, I just said your age, but she probably won't. It's like, and then imagine if she's like, doesn't quite have the physical mobility and she's sitting down in a chair, but I can bring her like a VR Oculus, whatever the new Oculus thing would be or whatever, and Oculus Rift, put it on, and she can be like she's front row at an Elvis concert, and you know what you would see in her brain? Fireworks. Memory center activated, visual centers activated, these deep emotional connections flooding the brain. You know, then you take my dad, maybe my dad's sitting beside her, and you take him and you do the same thing, but this VR is the 1972 Summit Series of hockey between Russia and Canada, and Paul Henderson's big goal in the last game, and it's like, put him at rinkside. Honestly, if you invented apps like that, or you worked at creating or if you're not computer savvy, it's like other people are going to, it's like what you do is you invent like kind of therapeutic rec style VR experiences for seniors. I don't think that exists yet. I know it exists because I've seen videos of people experimenting with that and having a lot of success at a very beta level. Like what I mean by that is like at a very test level, right? Like just there was like a pilot study that did it. But it makes sense because what it's basically doing is using technology to assist the reminiscence process, which we know is a part of successful aging later in life. So it's really just tying together two pre-establishing ideas, which is what most inventions are. Yeah, and any of you are super into tech and want to pair up for that, I think that's honestly an idea. It's like, it'd be an awesome grad project too, if any of you are kind of thinking about, I'm not sure at Nipsing if in your fourth year you do like a senior's honors essay or something. That's what we called it at Waterloo. But maybe even like a master's thesis. Because, you know, add to that whole thing I was just saying, this aspect that we know that, like, for that old guy, having, say, let's just say that's his granddaughter, I obviously don't know, but let's say that's his granddaughter, like, having that communication across generations, we know has incredible psychological benefit for both generations, right? For the granddaughter and for the grandfather, and for different reasons. But both because of, for emotional depth reasons, right? For the grandfather more because it's really good for people at that stage of life to feel like they're connecting with the younger generation, and for the daughter or the granddaughter, well, it's just this knowing where she came from and legacy and lineage. I think as Canadians, we also have to be very aware of how we're treating our older people, because it's becoming a bigger and bigger, you've maybe heard me say this, but a bigger and bigger part of our population demographically. Like they call it the graying of Canada. Our population is absolutely getting older, and there's going to be, our population is sort of, what would be the word? Not bell curve, but the exact opposite. But anyways, where there's like a lot of kids and a lot of old people and not a lot of people your age. Which is actually like a big problem a lot of colleges and universities are dealing with, is the low numbers of domestic students demographically, right? That just like literally there's just not as many teenagers as other demographics. It's interesting because I can remember at Conestoga being at a presentation with the people in recruiting, and they had it all graphed, and it was like, it was really shocking to kind of see the numbers of how many fewer teens there are in Ontario now. Has to do with like kind of birth rates from the generation before. Like these are all sort of like, obviously everything's connected. Yeah, but so sorry, I got off my point there. What I was kind of saying is that this, well, not really, because I was making the point that it's going to be this huge field, right? And a lot of you in CHSF that are in like, that are interested in working with people and interested in, I know that the focus is a little bit more on kids, but even that is interesting because, well, creating these kind of intergenerational opportunities, like having, like, older people that are still cognitively sharp and able to read should be reading to kids in schools much more than they are. That makes so much sense as an idea, right? And stuff like that, because it has these beneficial effects in both directions, and things that have beneficial effects in both directions. I don't know, there's just definitely something there. It's like an underemphasized thing that can be very healthy psychologically to our society. Vince Carter. Love him or hate him. He was my favorite player, then he demanded a trade out of Toronto, so then everyone in Toronto didn't like him for a bit, and then he got kind of older, and we kind of like all softened on him and realized like how amazing Air Canada was, right? Like Vince Carter definitely put Canadian basketball on the map, even though he's an American, but it was because he played for the Raptors. And he's one of my best examples of a guy that aged well as an athlete, and this is why I have him on this slide. These theories of late life psychosocial functioning that Bates and Bates, husband and wife, have this idea that older adults can maintain high levels of functioning. Because okay, so say you would maybe assume that at a workplace the younger employees would outperform the older ones, and that's almost never the case, which is pretty interesting. Even when you look at things like Navy SEALs and things that are pretty physical. Now, the one scenario where that really is the case is in pro sports, right? Like, and that maybe that's not surprising that like 28-year-olds tend to be better at pro sports than 40-year-olds. Better, again, is a weird word, because are they better at the sport, or are they just more athletic? And those aren't necessarily the same thing. So my point here is, though,
Vince Carter, what did he do? As he got older, he stopped being the guy that did all the crazy windmill dunks and stuff and started becoming more of like a defense player and a real team guy and really helped with the younger guys. And he concentrated on his strengths better than other people, right? And some other people that I can think of that as they got older as players and they kept trying to do what they did when they were younger, and then it worked less and less and less and less and less until they were out of the league. Right, but why I'm using Vince Carter as my example here is that people that are successful at work tend to start to learn what's like really important and spend their time on that. And so even if they maybe have less energy than younger people, they're focusing more on the signal and less on the noise, concentrating on strengths.
All right, my dear friends, even if you don't like basketball, you have to appreciate the athleticism involved in a reverse 360 windmill dunk. So this is the 2000 dunk contest. That's Vince Carter. It's hard to kind of, I'm like getting all like emotional. It's like, so this was in 2000. I can remember being at my buddy Greg Taylor's house. I can remember, because this is like at that stage of my life, so 2000, I would have been 19. This felt like Toronto's moment, right? It was like, I was a big Raptor fan. They had not been that good of a team up until then. Vince Carter was like Air Canada. He was like, Vinsanity, half man, half amazing, were all nicknames that people used for him. And it was like, I don't know, just a cool moment. But even then, you notice on the last slide, I had him like much older in his career still playing. And the reason I wanted to show like how he goes from this guy to this like example of a good veteran player is that as he went through his career, it's this term selective optimization with compensation. I'm going to kind of explain it. That he selected those things that he could focus on, right? So as he got later in his career, he's not doing as much of that, but he started to become a really good three-point shooter, really solid on defense, really good at communicating with the younger players, really good in the locker room as a leader, right? And he started to really optimize what he's good at there. And then kind of compensate for some of the maybe cognitive decline. Doesn't make as much sense because he only played into his early 40s, but more physical decline, right? Not being able to do that. So what does he do? He becomes like a bit more of a shooter and more of a defensive player, he kind of shifts his emphasis in how he plays. So this is all based on making this point that one of the reasons you don't see a dip in performance as people get older that you might expect, and why younger people don't outperform older people as much as you might expect, is because as you get into something for a long time, you start to realize, where does it make sense for you to be putting a lot of your time selecting? How do you kind of figure out, okay, these are the 6 things that are the most valued by my boss and by the people I'm working with. So then how do you optimize how you are at that and kind of compensate in the areas where you may be weaker? And that's why we actually see in a lot of scenarios older employees outperforming younger ones, even though the younger ones might have more energy or be whatever, less burnt out or whatever. Now, it's weird that I use this example because one of the only examples where this doesn't apply is in professional sports, because obviously like there's advantages based on pure athleticism. But then again, you have to like kind of go to the depth of that question and be like, well, is a younger 20-year-old who can like do impressive dunks like this, like is he better at basketball than old Vince Carter? Or is he just way more athletic? And are those different questions? Or are they the same question? Catch you on the next slide, my friends. So this is an important thing to know if you're doing anything in the field of working with older people, or like what I would kind of call therapeutic recreation. This idea that like activity theory is really important, that we know that adults that stay the most active and keep the highest level of involvement in things like both physically and cognitively and psychologically, so like and kind of conversationally with other people and stuff, they tend to maintain the highest levels of psychological functioning. So think about that, and that sort of makes sense. It's like if people that stay more engaged and more active, that staying active, well, keeps those capacities activated, to just use the same word in a different way, but active and activated are the same word, sort of. And so activity theory is this idea of like
Well, it's the argument basically for things like rec therapy. That actually what you don't want is the person just sitting in a room in a chair all day, right? You want them moving around. And because if that lady's not doing this with those elastic bands, she's going to have a lot more muscular atrophy in her arms, which is going to make everything harder. And then it's going to make her want to leave her room less. And then she's going to go to card night less. And then she's going to have that social interaction less. And then that's going to help with depression less. And then she's going to be a more sad person. And then, see, it's all like so spirally that what we know is that if they can stay active and engaged, that seems to be really linked with, you know, preventing downfall and all these other psychological and somatic and physical ways. Okay, so this next idea, so just the title of the slide, right? Other theories of late life. So psychosocial functioning, or just like how you're, and I think psychosocial is a good word to keep using. Obviously, it's Erickson's word, but also like it really kind of hints at this idea of how our psychological experience and our social world are so intimately connected, right? So that obviously then changing that social world or emerging aspects of that social world will shape our psychology, and that adults that are able to keep that social world engaging and also that are able to keep that social world interesting. Right, and I like this picture of this guy that's like bird watching. I'm definitely going to start being a bird watcher. I've already warned my wife that's going to be my old man hobby. I'm already starting to get into it. The house that I bought, I'd point to that cabinet behind me because I got the house that I bought. This house is, there's a story sort of behind it, but I bought it off. So my old kung fu teacher, who was like my best friend, his partner, after my kung fu teacher died, and then some time goes by, but then his partner Diane wanted to go to be with her family in Edmonton, and so I ended up buying this place. But anyways, that's just, I don't know, I didn't need to say all that, but I'll tell you that maybe in a different time. And when I got this house, her dad was like a bird watcher, so, and she was kind of like going to the other side of the country, right? So she was trying to be just kind of practical about how much stuff she was bringing. So she ended up like leaving a few things, and like some of the stuff she left was, I have like a few like classic like old school pairs of binoculars, and I got a couple small like kid pairs because my daughter likes it too, me and Evie. Looking for birds because we got a decent backyard for it. We got a lot of cardinals and blue jays, especially here. Lots of cardinals though, which are gorgeous. And then crows too. The crows are a bit more of a menace, but you have to be careful because crows remember. But yeah, that's gonna be my old guy habit for sure. Is because like, and just think about it. It's like the same. The psychology has similarities to like people that like to play golf, or people that like to go for walks, or people that like to go hiking or skiing, or it's like the being outside part, right? It's you're outside, you're walking around, you're doing something specific. You have kind of goals when you're doing it, but your goals aren't that intense. It's like that's kind of a perfect recipe for having just an enjoyable afternoon, especially throwing a friend that is interested in the same thing. Throw nice weather in a trail. Perfect. You know, it looks like some kind of crane or some kind of like kingfisher or some kind of water bird. I don't know. Ask me in a few years when I'm more into bird watching, I'll be able to tell you. Right now, I just basically know the ones that are in my backyard. But the thing is like the rant here has some meaning because like the point is that that's what matters. It's like earlier in the first half of the course when we're talking more about like the biology of the early brain, and we're much more like biological. And at this point, this is still biology, right? Because it's how all this is being captured and internalized. You know, like all the chemical and electrical messaging in the brain as a result of all this, right? Of like stimulation and being in situations which are engaging and where you're seeing things and where you're talking and you're being exposed to the cold wind, and it's like it's just very different than sitting in your chair watching TV all the time, right? There's obviously no problem with that, but like all the time. Some socially isolated elders tend to be most content when they have a hobby that's like all consuming, and that makes sense, right? It's like people that are, especially if they're more isolated, that isolation's more bearable if there's something that they're kind of fascinated in, that they're putting their time into, as opposed to like being more bored. So this is something to keep in mind as your parents get older, or maybe family members, or maybe people you're working with, that it's important to, if one of the best gifts you can give them is help them develop a creative kind of energy, what do I mean by energy, but like kind of effort-based hobby, so that they can be, especially once work pulls away, because it's how humans make sense of their existence, right? Is like, seems like human beings do better when we have projects. So another idea that you see sometimes is this concept called disengagement theory, right? And it's like the language here sort of makes sense, right? Think of like engagement, or to engage, to basically connect, and disengage, to take apart. It's like, you obviously know what those words mean, but it's like, I think important, because if you get that, then you basically get the idea that what are you disengaging from? It's like almost this idea of, as you're getting older, you're like the wolf that's walking off away from the pack. It's like there's this sort of shrinkage of your social space. So like you're not going to as many things, you're not seeing as many people, you're not attending as much random new things. The pool of people that you see in your social world is getting smaller, more confined, and more sort of specific, right? Maybe it's like the people that you do certain rec activities with, and then it's like, let's assume we're talking about someone in maybe a care facility, and then it's like the staff there and the people that visit you sometimes, right? So that's those kind of 2 points of the first point, that you're not only interacting with less people, you're also playing less roles, right? You're playing the role of either someone getting help, like a patient style role. You're probably maybe still playing a bit of a friend style role, right? Hopefully that's what the role of some of the rec stuff is. Hopefully you're still playing some kind of a family member role, right? But now this is kind of interesting too. There's like this increased individuality, in a sense of like, you can kind of do what you want again in some ways, right? Like you don't have the job obligations, but then you got to think like, well, what some of them want to do is just sit there, and it's like, well, I think we need to put a ton of attention to treatment of elderly, and what psychology, and sort of a combo of psychology and biology and therapeutic practices, like even things like that VR thing I was saying before. It's like, that is why I'm kind of highlighting this idea that I really believe that's a massively untapped market. And I'm not saying that just in the sense of like, oh, you could like design a VR app for like Elvis concerts for 50-year-olds. I mean, for people that wanted to relive the 50s, I meant to say. Although I think that would be a dynamite idea. But it's that this is going to be this huge population. This is a huge part of our country, right? And that they understand what's going on. It's like they understand that they're not 19, and they're starting to somewhat actively disengage and sort of accept what's going on. So this is this idea of that there's this kind of, well, disengagement theory is that as people get older, they start to pull back from some of these roles and categories that they've been placed in throughout their life, as a worker, as, you know, this type of person, as having to follow this, whatever. So there's this idea that's presented in the text, right, or kind of in developmental psychology more broadly, that although there's obviously differences between people, that there's certain things that we sort of associate with more healthy aging or more successful aging, and it includes things like maintaining physical health and trying to maintain cognitive abilities or retain, like not lose cognitive abilities as much as possible, and trying to continue being engaged socially and in things that are productive because of how that affects the mind and how that gives them something to focus on, and how to understand what is going to be a main source of life satisfaction, really understanding this integrity point and kind of pulling it in, and realize that, you know, age is more about change in terms of variability than universal decline. It's not like you just get worse at everything, it's that things change and there's variation on how you experience different things. So viewing it in terms of this change in variability, or in terms of, like, you know, it's a different experience of a similar thing. It's not just a worse version. So in a kind of interesting indirect way, a lot of these points are sort of case in point for things we talked about earlier in the course, and for establishing these habits early, right? Because it's like, yeah, like when you're in your old years, obviously things can come out of nowhere and people can develop illnesses or have accidents and stuff, but in general you tend to sort of, this is where a lot of the healthy choices or unhealthy choices sort of materialize, right? Like, it's like, this is where they actually have huge effect. Like, did you take care of your body decently and maintain decent relationships and think those difficult thoughts around spirit, and, you know, develop quality relationships? I might have already said that, but like all those, diet, things like exercise, it's like all those kind of pattern behaviors. Now you've been a pattern behavior creature for whatever 70 years. It's like the results of the healthiness of those patterns of behaviors is going to have this huge effect. And then you're also in this stage of life where things like rehabbing from falls and stuff like that becomes much more difficult. So this last point too is important, because one thing that the research is also really clear on is that when people are going through the difficulty associated with aging, the kind of story they tell themselves about it really shapes the process, which is kind of just a different way of saying what we've been talking about all day here, is that how you tell yourself the story about what's happening in your life and who you are in existence, in existence, yeah, but also in relation to your world. Right, so the story you're telling yourself matters at all these different stages of life, and when you're in this end stage of life, it matters in a big way, because you might be dealing with difficult things, and it's like, are you viewing this as poor me, or are you viewing this as like a transition? And this is where I'm trying to be purposely kind of respectful and a bit deeper, because it's like we're getting towards the kind of difficult topic, which we're going to be addressing in full next week, like around the idea of death and dying, which are different topics, obviously intimately connected. And then bereavement, which is another different topic, obviously intimately connected, right? There's the process of dying and the experience, and the experience of death for the individual, but also for the people around them, and the whole bereavement process of mourning and grieving that happens around the event. So it's like all those things are well, that's going to be basically chapter 13's presentation. So just so you know, just as a quick side note, this is the last one that's going to have a test, right? So by this point you'll have had presented chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Each of those has the short quiz. Then you have that one assignment, and then there's going to be another assignment. And that's basically it, right? So I tried to kind of create this course so it's kind of really content heavy in terms of what you need to respond to earlier. And then you'll notice, if you look at the schedule, like as we get a bit later in the, as we get a little bit later in the, yeah, I have Jurassic Park as my ringtone. A little bit later in the course, we'll get into some other content that I kind of have designed as special presentations that you're not going to be as directly tested on. So it gives you a little bit of breathing room, because I know that you have other courses and stuff too. So catch you on the next slide. Yeah, staying healthy. It's about mindset is huge, right? And how it makes sense in relation to their story they're telling themselves about their experience.
We're getting old. That's true on a personal level, of course. Every second you're sitting there surfing the internet, you're getting 1 second older. But it's also true in a global sense. The average age of humanity is going up, and going up pretty rapidly, especially in North America, Europe, and many parts of Asia. A report from the United Nations shows that the median age of the world population has risen from 23 in 1950 to 30 as of 2015. And by 2050, the median age for the entire world will be 36. In more developed countries like the United States, these trends are even steeper. The median age has increased from 23 in 1900 to 30 in 1950, and finally up to 37 by the time of the 2010 census. The population of elderly Americans, those 64 or older, is expected to more than double by 2060, going from about 46,000 as of 2014 to 98,000 in 2060. That's a huge change, so we owe it to ourselves to ask, why are people getting older, and what will that mean for how our society works? The aging of the world population comes from two facts. People are living longer and are having fewer babies. Social scientists use a model of demographic transition to explain that the process of moving from a young, growing population to an older, stable population is tied to the economic and technological development of a society. In this model, a country starts with really high birth rates and really high death rates, resulting in a population with a lot of very young people, but not much overall population growth. Then, agricultural and technological advances improve the standards of living. Access to food, water, housing, and medical treatment all improve, which reduces the number of people who are dying at a young age. People are still having a lot of children, but they're living longer, so this leads to a larger and older population. But then, in the next phase of the model, as the probability improves that a child will live into adulthood, families begin having fewer children. So their country reaches the final stage of demographic transition: low birth rates and stable death rates. And if there are fewer babies, that means there are fewer young people to pull down the average age. The total fertility rate, which is a projected estimate of the number of children an average woman of childbearing age will have over her lifetime, has been declining for most countries for a while now. For the United States, total fertility rates were at a peak of 3.7 births per woman in the late 1950s, but are now at only 1.8 births per woman. All of this means that we're looking at a future with a few more gray heads in society than past generations have had. So what does that mean for society? Before we can answer that question, let's look at some of the ways that sociologists understand aging. Aging is a biological, psychological, and cultural experience. The biological part you probably already know about. Aging increases risk factors for many diseases, particularly chronic diseases such as arthritis, heart disease, and diabetes. 78% of Americans aged 55 and older have at least one chronic condition. As infectious diseases like smallpox or tuberculosis become a thing of the past in high-income countries, chronic diseases have become the leading cause of death in those countries. That said, it's not like everyone over the age of 55 is teetering on the brink of the grave. As life expectancy increases, the age at which people first experience chronic illnesses is often also postponed. This compression of morbidity, a term coined by doctor and professor of medicine James Fries, means that most people in high-income countries live healthy lives for the majority of their lives, and then experience rapid health declines compressed into the end of life, which I guess is good, but there's a lot of variation in illness and mortality rates across demographic groups. Wealthier elderly people are less likely to face health challenges than the poorer elderly. Women tend to live longer than men, but that also means that they're more likely to suffer from chronic disabilities like arthritis. Why we age and how we age are still major questions within biology, genetics, and medicine. Senescence is the process of becoming old, which includes all the physical or mental deterioration that comes along with age. There are two main schools of thought in modern biological theories as to why senescence happens: error versus programming. Error theories, also known as wear and tear theories, focus on ways in which damage to cells and tissue accumulate over time, and explore how aging is a result of damage to or deterioration of key cells in the body. Programming theories, also known as aging clock theories, focus on how the body switches on or off certain biological processes as you reach a certain age. For example, the immune system is at its peak during puberty and slowly declines as you age, meaning that it's harder for your body to fight off new diseases when you're older. Along with the biological changes that people experience as they age, there are also psychological changes. Older adults are at a higher risk for dementia, including Alzheimer's disease and other types of cognitive impairment than younger adults. Thankfully, old age doesn't mean drastic psychological decline for most people. Only about 7% of adults over the age of 70 suffer from memory loss or a more serious mental deterioration. While the biological and psychological biological parts of aging are pretty well known. It's the cultural part of aging that I want to highlight today. How is aging perceived by society? Does being older mean that others see you as a wise elder or a washed-up dinosaur? Like race or gender, age is a trait that influences a person's social position in the world. Age stratification is the unequal distribution of wealth, power, and privilege among people at different stages of life. And of course, different cultures value their older citizens differently. Historically, if we were to compare hunter-gatherer societies where survival relied on physical strength with agrarian societies where food could be stored up, the elderly may be more likely to be seen as a burden in the former than the latter. But once it's possible to build up wealth, some people may be able to accumulate money and power over time, leading to greater privilege for an older person than a younger one. A gerontocracy is a form of social organization in which the oldest members of society have the most wealth, power, and prestige. As nations industrialize, however, the main source of income shifts from land ownership to income from work, and many older people move out of paid labor, whether it's by choice or because it becomes more difficult to find a job as you age. Only about 18% of Americans over the age of 65 report being employed either full or part-time. Nowadays, rapidly changing technology means that many older workers are finding it harder to compete with younger workers. Some of this is simply due to changes in what types of jobs are available, which may make the job experience of older workers less relevant in today's economy. But companies may also be less willing to hire older workers because of ageism or prejudice and discrimination based on age. Employers may unfairly generalize about the abilities of older workers, thinking that all older workers will be less productive or less up to date on the skills needed for the job. This is partially why we see so much stratification among older Americans. They're much more vulnerable to poverty, with 8.8% of Americans over the age of 65 living in poverty. Retirement from the labor force is, of course, voluntary for many people in high-income countries, and for some, it's a welcome break from the workforce. But for others, it's a difficult transition for both financial and cultural reasons. While many wealthier countries provide some kind of income support for the elderly, like Social Security in the US, retirement is generally only feasible for those who save enough during their working years to live comfortably after they've stopped working. In economic downturns like the Great Recession, the value of people's retirement savings will often plummet, forcing people to work further into old age than they intended to. But even for those who are able to retire, retirement can still be a difficult life transition. Especially in the US, many feel that their identity and self-worth is tied up with their profession. After all, what's the first question that you ask someone when you meet them at a party? So what do you do? When work plays such a central role in society, retiring can result in less social prestige as well as a loss of purpose. For some retired people, work in the labor market ends up being replaced with caregiving work. Caregiving here refers to informal, unpaid care provided to a dependent by family members, other relatives, or friends. About 42% of caregivers to the elderly are a spouse, more likely a wife taking care of a husband than the other way around, partially due to women's longer lifespans. Caregiving is a demanding job and can contribute to the social isolation that many older members of society feel. Limited time due to caregiving, lower mobility due to the aging process or chronic health problems, and the loss of aging friends and family members are all reasons that older Americans cite for feeling lonely or isolated as they age. Death is a bit of a grim note to end our discussion of aging on, but just as aging plays a specific cultural role, so does death. And as the saying goes, nothing is certain in life except death and taxes. Observing how death plays out in a society helps us understand the values and beliefs of a society. What is considered a good death? Death in modern society tends to be culturally removed from our day-to-day life, partially due to our longer lifespans. Nowadays, rather than dying at home surrounded by families and friends, many people die in healthcare settings like hospitals. The ethics of how doctors and patients navigate medical choices as someone nears the end of their life is a topic that's fraught with difficulties. Some patients leave living wills that explicitly state their preferences for treatment, but oftentimes these decisions end up in the hands of family members and doctors who may disagree on the best decision to make. How do people react to nearing the end of their lives or to the death of people that they love? You might have heard of the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, negotiation, resignation, and acceptance. Though psychologist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross originally developed this as a model for how people confront their own death, it has come to be seen as a model for how people deal with the death of those they love as well. Understanding how we as people process death and aging will only take on more importance in the coming years as the number of older people in society increases. Today we learned about the changing age patterns of the world. We discussed the biological, psychological, and cultural aspects of aging, And finally, we ended with a discussion of some of the difficulties faced by older individuals, including economic instability, retirement, caregiving, social isolation, and navigating medical decisions as they near the end of life. Crash Course Sociology is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney studio in Missoula, Montana, and it's made with the help of all of these nice people. Our animation team is Thought Cafe, and Crash Course is made with Adobe Creative Cloud. If you'd like to keep Crash Course free for everyone forever, you can support the series at Patreon, a crowdfunding platform that allows you to support the content you love. Thank you to all of our patrons for making Crash Course possible with their continued support.
So here's a good term, this idea of like the complexity of cognitive challenges being key, right? So it's like, I've said this to students a ton of times, and I really truly believe this. If you have an older grandparent and they've never really learned about YouTube, it's like take a Saturday and teach them about YouTube, and start by just getting them to tell you about the music they liked when they were kids, and just start looking it up and start showing them like videos that they like. I can remember, and maybe your grandparents already know, but like I can remember showing my grandma, and we were looking up like big band songs, and like she couldn't believe that like anything she could think of I could find basically. And it's like teaching them video games and stuff is actually amazing because it's challenging the brain in a unique way, and that activation is actually preventing decline as a positive effect on function. Now it's interesting because if you're like, okay, so now saying everything else is equal, and you look at people older in life, you can see that there's these kind of two factors that really affect people's cognitive decline. Like again, assuming everything else is equal. And one is their level of verbal intelligence, which sort of makes sense, right? Like how good are they conversationally? Like if you're sitting around playing cards and you're one of those three people, are you like someone that knows how to tell a joke and can tell a story and can listen and doesn't interrupt all the time, and like it's like your verbal intelligence actually is like kind of a big part of what gets you invited to different social things as you get older, and I guess education probably in a way of like, be interesting to see how that's specifically related. Maybe because you could obviously not have much education and still have tons to talk about, so I don't want to make that simple of a comment, but it does seem to be a related variable. So it's kind of interesting, right? But it's the more important overall point is that you have to keep working the brain, or else like any, well, I say like any muscle, but obviously the brain's an organ, not a muscle, but like anything that's muscular, it will atrophy in certain ways, right? So this is one of these new terms, right? Cognitive adventurousness. And that just means obviously kind of like what you would assume it would be, like the willingness to take new adventures mentally, like learn a new skill, like this grandma that you can assume in this picture maybe that she's a grandma and she's learning like how to use the internet and send an email, and it's like, yeah, it might look funny because she's typing with 2 fingers and staring really hard at the screen, but it's like what's going on in her brain right now is it's just a swirl of activity, and it's all like keeping, right, she's keeping her neurotransmitters warm right there. And that's good for her, right? And that just assuming that, like I say, their age is self-stereotyping, like having elderly people just assume that they can't learn tech is actually bad for their, again, it's not like they need to learn tech that they don't use, but it's like actually, I'm just using tech as an example of something that's a challenging new thing to learn, right? Like it could be a new type of technique of doing any kind of tool-based thing. Or writing, or art, or music, or pickleball. There's a pickleball court near my house that I see elderly people playing at a lot, and I went and played a few times. It's like, I can see myself getting into pickleball when I get older. It's basically like tennis where you just don't have to bend as much. It's great for older people, great for your legs to keep moving, great for eye hand, all the things that decline without use.
Have you heard the one about the 2 older couples who go out to dinner together? The two men are talking, and one of them says, you know, last week I went to this great memory seminar, and they taught me all kinds of tricks and techniques that I can use to help keep my memory sharp as I get old. And his friend says, man, that sounds good. What was the name of that seminar? First guy thinks, oh yeah, what's the name of that red flower with the thorns that smells good? A rose? That's it. Then he turns to his wife. Hey, Rose, what was the name of that memory seminar that I went to once? Now, that joke actually reflects a pretty common belief, namely that aging is inevitably associated with significant mental deterioration, or what's sometimes called senility. In fact, that belief is even reflected in the etymology of the word senility, which comes from a Latin word meaning old man. And the belief that senility is just a normal part of aging persists to this day. But it's wrong. So I'm a psychologist and a neuroscientist, and I study aging and the brain. And my goal in this talk is to convince you that maybe aging isn't what you thought it was, and to give you a more accurate understanding about how aging really is likely to affect your mind and your brain. Now, obviously, age-related diseases, like Alzheimer's disease, can lead to very significant mental deterioration. But in the absence of disease, it turns out that the mental effects of aging are actually restricted to a few specific cognitive processes, and many other aspects of mental life remain stable, and some even improve. In particular, it's important to distinguish between what psychologists call fluid processing and what they call crystallized processing. So, fluid processing refers to cognitive processes that don't depend on what you know. So, just can you think logically? Can you recognize patterns? Can you solve novel problems that aren't related to any previous knowledge? A good example might be the card game Concentration or Memory, where players take turns turning over pairs of cards, and they're trying to find pairs that match. If they find a matching pair, they take it, and if it doesn't match, they turn them back over. Well, that game doesn't depend on what you know, right? It just depends on your ability to remember the cards that have been turned over and exactly where they are on the table. So that would be a good example of a fluid processing task. On the other hand, crystallized processing tasks are tasks that do depend critically on your knowledge, on your experience, on your acquired skills. So think about solving crossword puzzles, for example. That depends a lot on your knowledge of the world, and so that would be a good example of crystallized processing. Now, it turns out that aging has dramatically different effects on fluid processing and on crystallized processing. So here's some data that was collected by my colleague Denise Park. And she recruited about 350 people ranging in age from 20 to 80. And she gave them all a battery of cognitive tests, including some tests of fluid processing ability. So for example, line span here, that refers to how many random line drawings you can remember. Reading span, how many random words can you remember? Computation span, how many random numbers can you remember? So the horizontal axis here, how old you are. The vertical axis is your z-score. That is, how well you did relative to everybody else being tested. So a z-score of 0 means your performance is average. A positive z-score means you're doing better than average. And a negative z-score means you're doing worse than average. And as you can see, with each passing decade, fluid processing on these tasks declines a little bit. And I suspect that when you think about the effects of aging on cognition, this is what you might expect to see. Although my bet is that you may not have expected the decline to start at age 20. Sorry about that. Here's the same kind of graph, though, looking at crystallized processing ability. Okay, so here's some tasks that do depend on knowledge, in particular, in this case, vocabulary. And what you can see is that, if anything, the older people are doing better than the younger people. Okay, so although fluid processing may decline as we get older, crystallized processing doesn't. And it's not just crystallized processing that's preserved. For example, your memory for skills and habits, like how to play an instrument, how to read, how to ride a bike, how to speak a language, how to cook, how to tie your shoe. These are what psychologists call procedural memory. So they're memory for well-practiced procedures that you know how to execute. And a number of studies have found that procedural memory also remains intact as we get older. It's not just procedural memory either. Emotional processing actually seems to improve as we age. For example, 65-year-olds, they actually typically report greater life satisfaction than people in their 20s. They also typically report fewer negative emotions, and they're better at resolving interpersonal conflict. So, the take-home message so far is that although fluid processing may decline a little as we get older, many other aspects of our mental life don't decline, and some actually improve. So, why is that? I mean, what is going on in the brain that might explain why fluid processing tends to decline, but other things don't? Well, I got interested in that question, and I decided to investigate it using a technique called functional magnetic resonance imaging. Now, many of you are probably familiar with traditional magnetic resonance imaging, and as its name suggests, MRI works by detecting magnetic differences in different tissues in your body. So, bone has different magnetic properties than muscle, and muscle has different magnetic properties than skin, and so on. And by detecting those differences, MRI can create detailed three-dimensional images of the interior of your body. And you can, with a few tweaks, you can use this same technique to take pictures of brain activity. Here's how. So, it turns out that blood that's carrying oxygen also has different magnetic properties than blood that isn't carrying oxygen. And so that means you can use this technique to take pictures of where oxygen is in your blood. And since oxygen tends to get sent to parts of the brain that are active, this means you can actually take a snapshot of brain activity at any point in time. And if you take snapshots every couple of seconds and you string them together, you can actually make a movie of brain activity while people are engaged in some cognitive task. That's functional MRI. And it has absolutely revolutionized the study of human brain function. And it has also revolutionized the study of the aging brain. Now, I started doing functional MRI in the 1990s. And at the time, I was interested in how reading is implemented in your brain. I mean, how does your brain recognize letters and words? So what I did was I recruited a bunch of college-age students, put them in an MRI scanner, and I asked them to read letters and words and to read digits and numbers. And I found something kind of surprising. You use different parts of your brain to recognize letters and numbers. And it turns out other researchers have reported similar findings. You also use a different part of your brain to recognize faces. You use a different part of your brain to recognize body parts. You use a different part of your brain to recognize buildings. So each of these different stimulus categories actually evokes quite distinctive neural activation patterns. At least that's true in young adults. But what happens as we get older? Well, to answer that question, we scanned a bunch of college-age people as well as older people averaging around age 70. And we asked them to process pictures of faces and pictures of houses. And then we looked at the patterns of neural activation that were evoked. And we asked, how distinctive are they? Okay? Are they really different? Is it easy to tell them apart? Or are they kind of confusable and it's difficult to tell them apart? Here's what we found. So each dot here represents one of the subjects in our experiment, with the young subjects on the left, the old subjects on the right. And the vertical axis here is how distinctive those two neural activation patterns were. How distinctive is the face pattern from the house pattern? Now, if you look at the young adults, you'll see that in every single one of them, they evoked very distinctive activation patterns in response to faces and buildings. But if you look at the older adults, you'll see that neural distinctiveness tends to decline a little bit as we age. But here's a critical point. It's not true for everybody, right? About half the subjects actually looked a lot like the young subjects, right? They were still evoking very distinctive neural activation patterns, but about half of the older people were showing less neural distinctiveness. And here's the cool thing. The very people who show reduced neural distinctiveness, those are the people who show declines in fluid processing. Okay, so check it out. Each dot here is one of the older subjects in our experiment. And on the horizontal axis is how distinctive those two neural activation patterns were. On the vertical axis is a measure of a bunch of fluid processing tasks. So how well did these people do on a battery of fluid processing tasks? And what you can see is the people with less distinctive activation patterns, those are the ones who do poorly on fluid processing. And remember, fluid processing is the thing that declines as we get older. Crystallized processing doesn't. Here's the same kind of graph looking at the relationship between neural distinctiveness and crystallized processing. And as you can see, now it doesn't relate. So what we have here then is a neural measure that actually relates specifically to the types of processes that tend to decline as we get older. And that's exciting because it means we might be able to investigate the potential causes, what's leading to neural distinctiveness declining, and maybe we could actually intervene and change it in the future. Okay, so I've told you one piece of very good news, which is that many aspects of your mental life probably won't decline too much as you get older. But there's another good piece of news that I'd like to share, and that's this. Your brains do not take aging lying down. They will actually reorganize themselves in order to try to process information more effectively. So, if I took the college-age kids in the room, stuck them in a scanner, and asked you to perform some task like retrieve some information from memory, what I would typically find is that you would activate one of your two brain hemispheres. But suppose I now recruit your grandparents. I put them in the scanner, and I ask them to do the exact same memory retrieval task. What I would typically find is that they use both hemispheres. Okay, so as you get older, you start recruiting new brain regions to perform the same task that you did with fewer brain regions when you were young. Now, here's a critical question. Is that a good thing? Does that actually help you perform the task better? Or does that reflect some kind of decline? Well, to address that question, a researcher named Roberto Cabeza at Duke University recruited 3 different groups of subjects. First, he got some high-performing young people, college-age students, who were doing well on a battery of fluid processing tasks. And then he recruited 2 different groups of older people. One group who were struggling with fluid processing and weren't performing as well, and one group that was still doing very well. And then he put them in the scanner, and he gave them a relatively difficult memory task, and he looked at brain activity. And here's what he found. In the high-performing young subjects, he found that they tended to just activate one hemisphere of their brain. In the low-performing old subjects, those who were struggling with fluid processing tasks, they also only activated one hemisphere of their brain. But check this out. In the high-performing older subjects, the ones who were doing well on fluid processing, they were the ones who activated both hemispheres. So it suggests that this recruitment of the other brain hemisphere is actually helpful. It's actually compensatory, and it's helping them perform the task better and age a little more gracefully. Okay, well, I hope I've convinced you that aging isn't just about mental and neural deterioration. In fact, many aspects of your mental life will likely be preserved, and many may even get better. And furthermore, you may start using parts of your brain that you didn't use before to help you age a little more gracefully. So I want to suggest that it might be more accurate to think about aging as a kind of transformation rather than as deterioration. Now, your golf scores may go up, your bowling scores may go down, your hair might turn a different color, but I think there's a lot more to look forward to than you may have thought. Thank you.
If you ever wonder why I leave on kind of the little tail ends of all those videos where it's like, on the next video, this is sponsored by, if you like this, check this. It's because, it's not because I'm trying to push you on those ads. It's because if I cut that off, for some reason it always messes up. It makes the recording glitchy. It's like, for whatever reason, PowerPoint, I think would actually, just had a thought, I guess I could trim the video in advance and then insert it. Then the other part is like I'm using their stuff, so I may as well let them play their thing, right? But again, if I was showing this in class, I would like have cut that out. Okay, so anyways, so friends are still important. Obviously, you probably don't need to be told that for older people, friends are still important, but we don't necessarily think of it that way. People that are in nursing homes report higher levels of life satisfaction when they're around people that they like, which sort of is obvious, but is interesting, right? It's like, well, one of the things that's really important to life satisfaction for these older people is still the quality of their friendships and their social world. And it's like, it's not just how comfy their bed is and, you know, how many books are on the shelf. It's like, do they have someone to talk to that they actually like being around? And we know that people that are staying active, especially when they're helping others, and it's like, sometimes you see these pairs almost naturally develop at nursing homes where there's someone who's maybe a little bit mentally sharper but a little more physically declined, and someone who's the opposite, and they're kind of like hang out, and it kind of makes a lot of sense, right? Because you see a lot of these kind of co-support relationships. Again, that's another whole interesting area of study that has like not a lot of research into it, is like some of the horizontal support that happens in these older communities. And you maybe heard me rant about before how if you leave the nursing home example and talk about how like sometimes an older spouse will care for their partner as they're dying or whatever, and it's like those are some of the most beautiful examples of humanity that exist, and you know, people don't see it. It's happened sort of in closed bedrooms where it's like the husband or the wife helping the other one or whatever to the bathroom in the middle of the night and struggling to get back in, and then getting her socks back on, and like all this kind of stuff, and making sure she's okay, and going and getting some warm milk or whatever it is. And it's like, I think that's one of the tricks for moving forward as a society, is figuring out how to like reintroduce the stuff that's the most important stuff as the most important stuff. The more those people that help others feel larger levels of satisfaction themselves. I kind of mentioned this idea earlier, right? It's like you see the guy there, and again, I'm going to read into it a bit, and it's like you can kind of picture him as like a grandpa, right? And maybe one of those kids is his grandkids, and maybe it's his grandkids' class, and he goes in and reads them. I can't really see what the name of the book is, but reads them some kid book, right? And it's like, what's going on there? That's amazing for the grandpa, right? The grandpa probably like whistled the whole walk home. It's like, it's so cool to be able to like, and I've had this experience sort of recently of like reading to like kids, and it's like when they're into what you're reading, it's like, and you make the voices and stuff, and it's like they respond. It's like, it's a very human, rewarding experience, and that's not even to mention how good it is for the kids to be exposed to, like, this is one of my things that I'm saying is like, this isn't an example of a perfect bidirectional therapeutic engagement, right? Like having seniors that are still able to read, and that maybe are the grandparents of one of the kids, have them come to the class and do a reading period maybe every Wednesday afternoon or something. It's like, man, the therapeutic power of stuff like that is incredible, and it's under realized. And this is where I think your field has some unique, or people with your specific training have some unique opportunities. Remember, most huge inventions are pulling things together that didn't originally exist doing something in a different context. So I wanted to show you this. So these mannequins are a salute to the fallen soldiers at this historical society in Arthur, and this is one of my grandpa's big projects, and all these pictures of people in the background are all people that lost their lives serving so that we would have freedoms. And to my grandpa, this was like, especially after my grandma died, like this has been a big thing that's given him a lot of meaning and a lot of purposes. This creation of this historical society, which is really very much a monument to World War II. If you look on the left there, you'll see like piles of books, and you'll see the one that's like kind of second closest to us, the white book that you can see has like the circle with the I forget what that's called, the spiral kind of binding. And I'm going to read a poem from that on the next slide, but this is actually something I used in a different context a few years ago, and I just want to reuse this video because it's kind of a tough one, and I don't know, I think you might appreciate it, and it kind of fits really nicely right here. And yeah, so just remember, so this is my kind of my grandpa's major hobby, and kind of life's purpose, I should say, but more than hobby.
Okay, what's up guys? I want to just see what, I don't know what this video quality is going to be like. This is the first time I've done one just using like the built-in video camera app or whatever. So let's see how this works. I wanted to just read this to you real quick. This is, now that I'm done my course specific stuff, I'm going to start venturing into some other cool content. This is actually, I don't know if this can turn up well. You can see that Memories of Arthur and Area, Volume 3. Alright. This is my grandpa's book. My grandpa just old school, you know, farmer slash pharmacist slash soldier slash well-known hockey coach, slash Jays fan, you know, had 8 kids, was a soldier. I don't know what else you can say about somebody. This poem, I'm not sure if he wrote it or, so his books are, I don't know if he would self-called it this, but kind of tributes to the soldiers of World War II, and specifically from the Arthur area. I dedicate this reading to the Arthur area, where a lot of my kin are, both my parents are from there, so the mainland and the Walshes. Now, the grandpa I was talking about that wrote this is still alive and healthy, and fighting strong. My other grandpa, who the two of them knew each other, my grandpa mainland is not alive anymore. He was also a soldier. So, yeah, there's some levels of complexity reading this. It's pretty short, but it's an awesome poem. A soldier died today. He was getting old and paunchy, and his hair was falling fast. He sat around the Legion telling stories of the past, of a war that he once fought in, and the deeds that he had done. In his exploits with his buddies, they were heroes, every one. And though sometimes his neighbors his tales became a joke, I don't know why this tripped me up so much. This might be the best line of poetry I've ever read. And though sometimes to his neighbors his tales became a joke, all his buddies listened quietly, for they knew whereof he spoke. Let me say that again. And though sometimes to his neighbors his tales became a joke, all his buddies listened quietly, for they knew whereof he spoke. His buddies listened. His buddies knew. Other people didn't know. They couldn't relate. But we'll hear his tales no longer, for old Bob has passed away, and the world's a little poorer, for a soldier died today. He won't be mourned by many, just his children and his wife, for he lived an ordinary, very quiet sort of life. He held a job and raised a family, going quietly on his way, and the world won't notice passing, though a soldier died today. When politicians leave this earth, their bodies lie in state, while thousands note their passing and proclaim that they were great. The papers tell of their life stories from the time that they were young, but the passing of a soldier goes unnoticed and unsung. The politicians' stipend and the style in which they live are often disappropriate, Let me start that sentence again. The politicians' stipend and the style in which they live are often disproportionate to the service that they give. Never has a truer sentence been said. While the ordinary soldier who offered up his all is paid off with a medal and perhaps a pension that's small. It's not the politicians with their compromise and ploys who won for us the freedom that our country now enjoys. He was just a common soldier, and his ranks are growing thin, but his presence should remind us that we may need his like again. For when countries are in conflict, we find the soldier's part is to clean up all the troubles that the politicians start. Yeah. If we cannot do him honor while he is still here to hear the praise, then at least let's give him his homage at the ending of his days. You know, we all make a big deal about when someone famous passes, and that's fine. And part of that is because we relate to these people. I think it's interesting, though, to think of the common person. You know, in these, especially if we're talking about something like World War I and World War II, there was tremendous sacrifice that never had immediate reward, tremendous sacrifice for future people who are you. All right, that's why things like Remembrance Day matter so much. We need to remember that that's part of the history that provided the ground that we now stand on. You know, as free people. All right, I'm getting a little ranty, but I'm talking about both my grandpas right now, and they're both dear to me, and you know, I don't know how this video is going to come out quality-wise, but the politician's stipend and the style in which he lives is often disproportionate to the service that he gives. They often live like they're here, and they help you this much, and they tell you they help you this much. It's like, that's what I'm saying, is like to assume that past generations didn't have tremendous wisdom is foolish. It's foolish. Wise words. Anyways, miss you guys, and I hope that well, I don't know. I'm gonna start coming out with new stuff. I don't really hope anything right now. I hope that you guys find something useful out of this. You know, maybe I need to brush up my appearance a bit if I'm going full screen, but whatever, we're during this COVID stuff, we're just doing our best, right? And Evie is upstairs playing, and I think I just got myself a nice little 10-minute window to rip out a video, and she's still watching Rapunzel or Tangled or whatever upstairs. So anyways, love you guys. I'll be back soon. I got tons of ideas for content. I'm just kind of testing out to see if this straight video works. I'm probably going to do more, I got more Screencastify stuff coming. I just learned another new app where I can kind of edit and annotate videos, and so expect to see some of that coming soon. And yeah, whatever. You don't have to sign up or tick anything or do anything. Just keep being the awesome person you are, and don't believe the hype. All right, cheers.
Okay, so I know that last video was kind of raw. I don't know how to redo something like that. without it being super fake. So even though I would have liked to have that more polished, it's like, I don't know, then you get into this weird, like, is it more polished but more fake better than less polished but more authentic? And sometimes it's difficult when you're weighing those things. So we know that as we get later in life that, you know, sense of control is important to well-being. So it's like, think about that for a sec. It's like some people like going into retirement homes and some people don't. And a big factor is, was it their choice or not? And that's true for things like retirement too. That's true for like ending relationships too. It's like if you feel like you've kind of reached the end with this person and they feel the same sort of, and you're both kind of okay with it and you both sort of want it, and you actually, and oftentimes that's not actually true, but say that actually is true, and so you both walk away from it, it's like that's gonna hurt you a lot less than something that you really wanted to continue. And that's true with dating, that's true with marriage, or, well, think of how much having a dying spouse is a sense of losing control. Same thing, same kind of idea with retirement, right? You heard me say this maybe last week, I think, that when people retire in situations where it was their choice, they tend to report it as a much more positive situation where than when they kind of get early retired or downsized or forced to retire, basically. So control is a huge impact at this stage. Here's another interesting thing, right? It's like, what's another, because these are all things that impact life satisfaction. Another interesting one is how much the person thinks they have social support. So notice how that doesn't say like actual level of social support. It says perceived adequacy. So like, does the person think that their social world is like lacking compared to others? Are they in a retirement home where everyone else gets visitors constantly and they never do? And even though that their loved ones do, maybe, right? So anyways, basically what I'm saying, it's a comparative subjective measurement. It's how much they think that they're being socially supported, right? Because you could have someone that their family only comes once in a while, but they have good relationships and they don't have tons of, they're not super high need, and so they're actually pretty cool with it. And so it doesn't have this huge negative effect on life satisfaction. So it's all situational. These self ratings of health are critical, just like everything, right? It's like the oldest people that seem to do the best are kind of the wiry ones that are like, you know, I just kind of got these old creaky bones and I do my best, rather than harping on the single thing, right? Especially if it's something that's maybe you're in your 90s and that bad knee is never going to be perfect. Right, and the seeing others as having more problems than oneself contributing to life satisfaction is kind of this interesting point of how, like, so often happiness is comparative. And in Chinese philosophy, there's the story of the guy that's walking, you know, he's riding his donkey down the street and someone passes him on a beautiful white stallion horse, and the guy feels jealous but forgets to notice that he just walked past on his donkey somebody that's just walking. And to the person that's just walking, having a donkey for this long journey would be a massive upgrade. And it's just sort of this idea of like when you're climbing a ladder to look up and down. Not literally, don't look down when you're climbing ladders, but it's this idea of like there's people above and below. And that's an important thing to remember in life. Here's just sort of another interesting idea that as people get older and as they start to get closer to their own end and as they start to think more about these ideas of integrity and also like mortality and spirituality and all this stuff, that there tends to be this pull towards more religious ways of making sense of things and coping with things. This tendency to turn to more religious beliefs or institutions in times of trouble. And it's not a surprise that there's things like chapels at hospitals. This may be important more and later in life because of the specific nature of these kind of existential stresses. And it may be a primary form of coping. So just to keep going on this religious coping point for a sec, it's like, it's interesting to note that when you ask older people if they're religious or not, the people that answer that they're religious tend to also report worrying less about death. And it sort of makes sense, right? Because it's like, well, if you have a story about that contextualizes your death in a way that you can make sense of, and that you can, especially if it's connected to a vision of the afterlife that you're planning on partaking in, you can see how that would help quell some of your angst and your worry. And what's interesting is it doesn't seem to matter what the faith of the person is, right? This association between religious faith and physical and mental health seems to be reported across diverse faiths. It seems like people that are religious also tend to contextualize their life as seeing things more linked and as part of this grander story, which is sort of interesting, right? That actually like religiosity or whatever sort of affects the framing of your life story. And here's the other interesting point, right? I say they're like people that have less income tend to be more spiritual, which is just, there's endless interesting things about that. And one of them is maybe when you have less resources, there's a maybe motivation to hope for solutions outside of the box. There's other interesting social aspects of religious belief too, right? It's like there seems to really be, like if your grandparents go to church, that's a good thing in a lot of ways, because it's like it's not just that, you know, they get to go practice their faith, it's also that they get to go and see some people that know them and like them and maybe ask them about how they're doing, and maybe if they notice that there's some problem can get them some help or whatever. There's this idea of that this is like, well, you're just engaged in a community of people that care about you. We know that people that attend church more are more likely to comply with medication advice, about because maybe they're able to talk to someone else that's going through the same thing, and it's like, oh, I take that kind of heart medicine too, and you know, make sure that you take it in the morning before your coffee or whatever it is, right? And maybe it's not that it's like, oh, they're more manipulatable and they'll do more what you say. It's not that. It's that maybe they're in a social context where they're better able to sort of talk about things and understand what they're going through. So it's this interesting thing of like, this seems to be a really important thing for people as they get older. Now you could ask the interesting follow-up question about like, what's this going to mean for a generation in, you know, 30 or 40 years that grows up much less religious? Because today's old people are still sort of the tail end of generations before that were much more religious. So I don't know how this is going to change. It'd be logical to assume it might. But is what people view as religion just changing, which is sort of Nietzsche's critique, right? Is it just like politics or whatever now? So I know, and obviously there can be problems associated with organized religion. I want to kind of say though, in an ideal sense, some of the positives that it can be is like that idea of it can provide an avenue or a way for helping people. And you really, when you sit and think about it, you realize there's like, I go and get things at a store and come back here and take care of my kids, and I'll maybe, if I wasn't doing a job where I interact with people, say I'm like doing like plumbing or something, and I'm going and doing this and going and doing this and going and do these tasks, and maybe not even plumbing, maybe something where there's less going to people's houses. It's like you don't have maybe a ton of times in your day to like do nice things for the next generation, right? And we're saying like, okay, well, when you're later in life, that's going to be this generativity idea, right, that we talked about last week. So one of the advantages that you could talk about that religion or religious institutions give is this opportunity for these intergenerational opportunities to help people and to pass down knowledge to younger individuals. And this idea that like, yeah, there's examples of corrupt church organizations and all kinds of evils. And it's because it's because of all kinds of reasons. But I think there's a danger of discrediting all of it, especially I don't even know what I'm trying to say here because it's such a complex issue. It's just a complex issue, and it's something we could, spend a whole course on. But the point I wanted to make here is just that as people get to this older time, one thing that church membership, regardless of denomination, provides is an opportunity to engage in people in things that to those in groups feel meaningful intergenerationally in a way that's related to knowledge and hopefully benefiting these younger people in a way that makes complete sense within the Erikson idea of generativity and integrity. Here's another kind of interesting point, that as we get later into adulthood and later into our marriages, when you ask people like what are some of the things that become core to like having a strong marriage later in life, and it's these things like, and it kind of makes sense, right, that if you're going to be with someone for your whole life, that things like loyalty and feeling like when you're with them, you're with somebody that's familiar and that's your companion, you have this like mutual investment in each other, you're taking care of each other. This, I say, that remarkable care that older individuals give each other. Tends to be less conflict, more levels of pleasure and just enjoying each other's company, right? Because again, if you're going to be married for 50 years, hopefully you figured out how to have certain types of arguments, or at least gotten a bit better at it, that idea of skilled diplomacy from last week. Oops. One of the toughest things that can happen in life is the loss of a partner. Again, just shattering to people's worldview and their sense of self and their sense of how they make sense in the world. Men tend to remarry at higher rates and date more after losing a spouse, but that's also very misleading because women live longer. So there's more, the dating market, I guess, at that age, which is a really weird way of talking about dating of like 80-year-olds, but it definitely, there's definitely a lot more women than men, so that's a huge factor, and part of that's because women live longer. In Canada, it's like 3 or 4 years longer on average. It's different between the early 80s and the mid 80s. I think I probably gave you a strong stat for that in the first half of the course. Such a tough topic though, right? I say they're like both men and women benefit emotionally from remarriage. It's like if I was to pass for some reason, it's like I don't want my wife to be single for the rest of her life, but at the same time it's like not fun picturing her remarried, right? So it's this weird thing where it's like, but at the same time it's like my wife now is like turning 35. It's like I don't think she should, like, again, it's like the most terrible thing to have to think about, right? Like if you were gone and your spouse is remarried, but it is probably better for them. But it doesn't have to make it a comfortable thought for you, right? Like, another thing that the developmental psychology literature is like crystal clear about is that there's definitely psychological benefit to being married, and like a lot of the research has been between basically married and single, and this is where it can be a bit misleading and you have to kind of use your intellect to make sense of this, because it's like a lot of the earlier research in developmental psych was being done in a scenario where if you weren't married later in life, you probably were single. Nowadays, like, there's a lot more people that aren't married that are in relationships, right? And so maybe you're with someone for a really long time, and as I kind of said earlier in the course, if you're with someone for a really long time and plan on being with them forever, you're going to be experiencing a lot of these psychological benefits too, right? Higher life satisfaction overall, better health, lower rates of being institutionalized in like a care facility. This advantage is even more pronounced for men than women, which is interesting. And part of it actually has to do with trait agreeableness, and that women tend to score higher on that. So men are more likely, if they're single, to become recluse, right? To pull back completely. And you can actually use the trait of agreeableness from the Big Five personalities to explain a lot of that. It's one of the most significant personality differences between men and women. Okay, so just a few more points here. Friendship can provide important support networks, right? And it's like part of this is just kind of obvious, but it's also not, because it's like this is kind of key. Is I think sometimes when we're thinking about like older people care, we're thinking about like it very medically, when we're thinking about it much less as crafting an awesome kind of psychosocial experience for them, and how that sort of has this ripple effect through the immune system and through the body and has all these positive benefits. That they can improving life satisfaction, improving self-esteem, reducing loneliness, providing compassion, having more kind of ability to have more equal or kind of less always care-based relationship with family members, right, than those with family members. What I mean is, like, one of the important things about having friends is, like, it can be the person you go and watch movies with. It doesn't have to be someone that comes to help you do something specific, so that it feels like every single relationship you have is care-based, like you're a patient all the time, which you wouldn't want and you won't want when you're older either. Friendship can also maybe help. Maybe they go to church together, or they go to get groceries together and stuff like that. It can also help with those really practical daily things. Here's another word that's kind of popular, although fictive is a weird word because it kind of means not real, but fictive kin is like, and I guess technically it's right because it means like a person who's kind of like a family member but not a family member. And you might have someone like that that's like, maybe it's one of your friends who isn't your sister, but your family sort of treats like your sister. She's at all the family events, whatever. Maybe you have an aunt like that that's not really an aunt, that's like one of your mom's friends or something like that. Right, that this fictive kin, or these sort of friend members who become almost to the level of family, are really important as we get older. Right, so I say that men's friendships tend to involve less disclosure and intimacy, and that's true from teenage right till the end. Women tend to have larger networks. I think that's true from teenage right to the end too. But just because of that, when you ask men or women, older men or women, about how much their social world sort of affects their mental health, it's basically the same. So just because what that relationship plays out as, and one's less based on disclosure or whatever, it's like they're both as relevant to mental health for the, for the people we're talking about. So this kind of last slide, and then I have, so anyways, thanks for watching today. This is going to be kind of my last slide. I'll make some points here, and then I have a video that I have on the next slide as the kind of finisher and as a segue to next class. Our health doesn't change simply because of retirement, but obviously retirement's this huge change in a lot of people's life at this stage, and it's not always stressful. It can have actually no negative impact on overall life and actually improve well-being, especially if the person has control, right? And this is kind of what it says there at the bottom in blue, which was a point I was ranting about earlier, is that people that tend to deal the worst with retirement are the ones where it's less their choice, right? And it's more imposed on them. So just like any time in life, it's like this idea of psychological autonomy is really important for mental health. I love you guys and girls. Great class. It's honestly a joy to work with young academics who are as cool and kind and solid as all of you Nipissing students. It's an honor. Cheers. See you in the next one.
Arguably, the primary source of all fear, sorrow, and existential conflict is the self-awareness and foresight of our mortality. The fact that we can live a life that feels so real, so important, and so incredible that we are compelled to want it to go on forever. The fact that we can speculate and comprehend the possibility of the infinite, yet be forced to live with the realization that we are finite, and everything we do and care about is subject to the short timeline of our life. At some point, everything will evaporate away into nothingness. As humans, this is our curse. We are the seam between the infinite and the finite, able to ponder and long for the eternal, yet be bound to the impermanence of our deteriorating body. But perhaps in some strange, puzzling way, this is also our blessing. Currently, we cannot control the biology of our human organism. We cannot control the fact that we live inside of a decomposing carbon-based body destined for expiration. But we can control, at least to some degree, the way we view and think about things from within it. And so we can control how we think about the idea of our death and rationalize with it in a way that reduces some of its torment and allows us to make the best of our life before it arrives. In order to do so, consider a video game, board game, or sports game that you have played in the past. What was the driving force of playing said game? Certainly, you enjoyed playing the game for itself, but you were ultimately playing towards something. You were playing the game towards an end point, and arguably you only played the game because you knew there would be an end point. The human mind is seemingly fixed on requiring an end point to derive meaning and motivation for doing things. What would a game be without an end? Would we even play? What would a story be without a conclusion? Everything we construct and do in life, whether intentional or not, has an end point. Death is life's end point. It is our motivation to play the game of life and to create our narrative within it. Without it, we would not care to leave legacies through our careers, passions, and families. We would not want to positively impact the world around us. We would not be inspired to create fascinating art, develop exciting technology, and incite innovative ways of thinking. And we would not work to make the best out of life and find wonder in all its simple pleasures. To live with the knowledge and angst of our impending mortality is undoubtedly the curse of humankind. But it is paradoxically our blessing in disguise. Perhaps our brains cannot discern meaningful existence without an endpoint. Ironically, death is the reason why we cherish life so deeply, and it is because we cherish life so deeply that we fear death with such great intensity.
Thank you for watching. If you found enjoyment and value in this video, please give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you are not already, be sure to subscribe to our channel. We are constantly coming out with new videos to help you experience life with clarity and wonder.